A debate over the death penalty will face the state's Board of Pardon next week. The commission that includes Governor Sisolak will vote on whether to turn death sentences into life sentences. Fox 5's Drew Andre is here to break down how many inmates this will impact. Drew.
So, Joe, there are 65 inmates on death row. Zane Floyd was the most recent to have a scheduled execution date, which has since been put on hold. And this is Edward Wilson, who's the longest serving person on Nevada death row. He killed a Reno police officer in 1979, and the vote next week could spare their lives.
Inmates at Ely State Prison's death row spend most of their days locked in a cell, knowing being strapped into a chair like this could be their future. The death penalty is long debated. In 2021, the Nevada Assembly passed a bill that would have repealed capital punishment, but the state Senate did not act after Governor Steve Sisolak said he believes some crimes deserve the death penalty, suggesting he would veto the bill.
I have a hard time with the idea of a complete abolishment of the death penalty.
But this week, the outgoing governor has signaled a change of opinion. He requested that the Board of Pardons Commission add an item that would commute all death sentences to a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. His communications director tells Fox 5 the governor believes this is a worthy item for the commissioners to consider and will be voting in favor of the measure. Sisolak sits on the board alongside Attorney General Aaron Ford and 6 justices from the Nevada Supreme Court. Since 1979, 12 people have been put to death in the state. The most recent was convicted murderer Daryl Mack in 2006. Zane Floyd, who murdered 4 people in Las Vegas in 2000, was supposed to be put to death last year, but his attorney challenged the new combination of drugs the state would use in his execution, insisting the lethal injection would be cruel and inhumane. Another execution date has not been set.
And in recent years, the state has struggled to find drugs necessary for lethal injections. That's because drug companies have tried to restrict the use of their products in capital punishment. Joe?
All right, Drew, thanks. And the Board of Pardons will consider commuting the death sentences on Tuesday, and Fox 5 will cover that meeting.